Okay, welcome everyone to this two-day work conference or work seminar. We'll have keynotes in the morning and then we're all streamed. So, hi there, everyone around wherever you are to this meeting. I hope we'll have a very interesting conference for 2 days. And we tried to make it in the way that we have keynotes in the morning. And in the afternoons, you will be divided, or you have selected 1 out of 3 themes. And we will have, hopefully, a more intense discussion in the groups formed in the 3 themes. And we'll hope to come up with something that we can write about later on. Some ideas about where to go in terms of engagement research. So I will not say that much more. I think we're already a little bit late, which is rather common. Not for Swedes, though, but anyhow. That's just the situation, so we have to live with that. Okay, so I'm just starting. Again, before that, welcome everyone. I think I've met almost everyone before. Maybe not everyone, but almost everyone. And it's always fun to meet. So be happy and talk a lot. And it's even more interesting if you don't only have positive comments. Good discussions is always good. Okay, you read an article before you came on the framework, family of participation constructs. So I will not talk about that, but I'll start with the 2 dimensions of participation very briefly. One is being there. That's very much attendance, and you cannot really participate unless you're there. And this is also maybe the main focus, or have been the main focus of inclusion research. Are the children there or not? And it has to do with frequency of attending, duration of attendance, diversity of activities attended. And it seems very simple, and it is in a way very simple, but it's not that simple to make it true. So it's not only a matter of being in school, but what are you really doing when you are there? Do you attend the same situations as other people? So that's the key issue to discuss. And that brings us to the other dimension, which is involvement or engagement. And it has to do what you really do and what you feel and your perceptions when you're in an activity or situation. And of course, then we talk much about accommodation or adaptation of the situation and acceptance in the environment, both from you yourself and the ones that you're meeting. So why engagement as an outcome? Well, we already said it. Being there does not automatically mean being engaged while being there. And that's a key issue then. How can we combine being there with being engaged? The problem is that people can focus their attention on different aspects of the same activity. So even if we're sitting in this room now, some of you are sitting far back, other ones are sitting up front. Maybe because you're a lecturer, or maybe because you like to sit up front, which is something different, and then you tend to be a front sitter in different meetings. And it means that you probably have more eye contact with the lecturer. You probably talk more to the lecturer, but you don't see as many necks as you do if you're sitting far back. So maybe you're better at recognizing people from behind after 4 years in professional training, sitting far back in the room. Okay, so it means that you actually learn and perceive different things in the same activity. And this, of course, is a key issue when we talk about both inclusion and participation. What are actually the experiences of people, even if they are in the same environment? And maybe also this individual variation in task engagement within the same activity is one of the key issues when we discuss impairment and disability. That maybe even if people are there having problems of some kind, they might not experience the same thing as others being in the same situation. But it also makes it very, very difficult to do research on that. And that's what I think we really have to discuss today. How can you actually research differences in what you actually experience in the same activity or same situation? We know that engagement is a strong predictor for both learning and well-being. But what actually is engagement, and how can you measure it? And what is it really? Is it a state or is it a trait? Some people tend to be more engaged wherever they come. But it's also very much dependent on the context and the environment. And context is a word or we really need to discuss as well. I think it's a difficult word to use because it's used in so many different ways. We talk about in the context of preschool, and then it's actually about the environment, not about what we mean with the context. So it might be better to call it niche, like Super and Harkness have done. So we can talk about being there and involved while being there on many different levels. We can talk about it for the individual. Sorry about that. That's what you tell everyone not to do. And then you do it yourself. But that's, well, it might say something about me. Well, anyhow, we can actually look on the individual. And we can look on how they allocate attention to different things. So it's actually starting in the brain. We can talk about the individual within the close context or close environment, at home, in school, in meeting, healthcare. And we can look on what kind of situations do the person attend and what is their sense of belonging, their engagement, what are they focused on, their interaction. We can look into things that might affect that in the person or in the environment. But we can also use it on the next level, relations between systems. For example, how do nurses interact with clients in a healthcare situation? What's their engagement and what's the engagement of the client in that? Or when a therapist meets a child. Christine will talk a little bit about that. And then we can also look on engagement and participation in society. Politics, democracy, things like that. It might be a very good start in these days, but we will not talk about politicians in different countries today. Okay? So what's the link between being there and involvement? It's time spent. Time spent in preschool, family, so on. Time spent in different activities in the environment. We know, for example, that children with profound multiple disabilities tend to spend time partly in other activities than children without profound disabilities in family, in home activities. They tend to do more passive activities and less active activities. Like Anna-Karin, who's sitting far back there, have studied. We might also look into time spent in high involvement. So probably children learn more when they are in high involvement or engagement. So even if they spend time there, they might not be involved, and then it might not give them as much experiences. Or they might experience something else because they are engaged in something else than other children are. And this is the same if we're looking in meeting professionals. Time spent in meetings where decisions are taken. Are parents there? Are the children themselves there when decisions are made? Time spent in individual intervention and time spent in high engagement in decision making or intervention. Do we work in a way that make people engaged in decision making? Do we work in a way that makes them engaged when they're in an intervention session? And it's all related to being there in an environment or an involvement. So I think we have some things that we need to discuss. One is effort and attention as universal aspects of impairment and health condition. Context niche, a universal continuum from child constructed to environmentally constructed context. How do impairments restrict possibilities to construct context? Environment, existing independent of the individual child. how do the environment affect the context that affect the child? Differences between developmentally framed and functionally framed construct. Is engagement something that changes with development, or is it not? Is there any reason to believe that a 2-year-old is less engaged than a 10-year-old? If not, then we cannot use a developmental frame for talking about it. Relations between components or ecological levels. Emergent properties on system levels. Things that you don't see unless you move one level up in a system. We cannot understand children's behavior in preschool without looking on unit characteristics, which means that we have to go above the child, so to say, to explain partly why the child is behaving in a certain way. And how do we link that to the child? And also direction of influences. We usually look into how do the environment affect the child, but we spend much less time looking into how do the child affect the environment. So these are things that I think we need to discuss at these days. Just a couple of illustrations. We have 2 women here. The one on the left-hand side is a woman, just a woman. The other one is also not just a woman, but also a woman that has a prosthesis on one leg. And she's had a prosthesis for a long time, and still she needs to allocate attention to walk. This means that she actually will not participate socially in taking a walk. She cannot talk and walk. Okay? And it made her having other experiences in taking a walk. Doesn't matter in a week, but what about after 10 to 20 years? And maybe this is a key issue because it's not only about allocation of resources because of a lost leg. It could just as well be because of not understanding the language or problems with vision or hearing. But it might be the universal effect of that is that you're actually not learning or experiencing the same thing as others. This is more about context. This is observations of children using the kind of observations that we learned from Dale Farron. And we see that children in need of special support spend a little bit more time in low engagement than other children in preschool. This is an overall measure. And if we look into free play, this is much stronger. The effect is much stronger. And if we compare that to the environment is decided by the teacher. This is free play. But within free play, the requirements on the child increase, which means that they partly construct other contexts. The children in need of special support may do other things in free play than other children do. And what's the effect of that? Not after 1 week, but after 3 or 4 years in preschool. And this is just to show, we took a measure, it's called Children's Engagement Questionnaire by Rob McWilliam, and we forced it in 2 factors, based on whether it's related to chronological age or not. So we have one set of questions that is very much related to chronological age, and one that is not. And if we look over time, over 3 time points, children's degree of engagement, and it's going down because it will look and you see less difficulties, the lower the better. It's data that are linked to ICF codes, so it's presented in ICF codes. And you can see if we measure core engagement, we don't have that much of a developmental profile. And after adjusting for some people here, we have it more or less like a straight line, which means that we cannot see any relationship between chronological age as a proxy for development and engagement. And this is very important, because I think that the outcome of inclusion is not developmentally based. And it means that core engagements, is that the key outcome of inclusion? So that's one of the things that I want us to discuss. And it's not only about in the living environment, but also in terms of being part of decision making and so on. If we adjust the situation, it might be possible for a child to have their own ideas. Okay? Thank you. That's it. So now we go on. And I think I need a little sheet to introduce people in the correct way. Not Rune though, that starts now, because Rune, I've been knowing Rune since 19 something. He doesn't want to talk about it. But anyhow, we met in a very interesting place called the Gothenburg Conference on Mental Retardation, which I think still exists, but now it's a huge conference with a lot of people. But by then it was one of those small ones that when you read in old books about researchers, you talk about a little number of intellectuals that meet and have intense discussions about something. And that was the Gothenburg Conference. People could stand up and scream, "I don't think so!" So it was like the sessions would be in the afternoon. Okay, Rune has been working with children, early intervention and children in need of support for a lot of years. He had a big impact, especially with the ICFCY child version. That was very much because of Rune. And you still do a lot of important work all around the world. So today you will talk about inclusion in an international perspective. Rune Simonsson. This is like an IQ test with these things. I never succeed.
I'm supposed to wear this too. Put it on. Yes, I need help. Does that work?
That's okay for you?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Mats, and it's really wonderful always to be back. Alltid så underbart att vara hemma i Jönköping igen. I alla fall. Well, if I'd known everyone was going to be here from every possible part of the world, Mats should have just said, each of you will get 2 minutes and you can present this, make this presentation much better than I could. But since he didn't do that, I will, where's my no, I don't recognize. He's finding it. I'll just do Mats's again.
Should you take Christine's instead?
Sorry. Vad är den då? Här. Så. Yeah, that's it. There, well. Jag börjar med den. Okay, we're going to say the one. Okay. So, and you will hold up a sign when I'm supposed to stop? 5 minutes? Okay. So, Mats gave me a kind of a complicated topic, and I didn't really know what to do with this. I gathered, I don't know how much papers, and I thought I can't possibly review this material in the traditional way, so I chose some other ways, and I hope you will work with me today. But it is a topic that's of interest, great interest for all of us, and because of the elements that have to do with inclusion. So I want to ask these questions today. What defines inclusion? What is the basis for inclusive policy? What are the elements defining implementation of inclusion? What kind of evidence, and I think Mats has already anticipated some of these things and talked about the kind of evidence that we might think about. And then what are considerations for inclusion as a universal agenda? And that's why the topic was international perspectives. It is being implemented widely, although primarily in the Western world, but it is finding its way into other parts and regions of the world as well. Let me have a disclaimer at the front. These are sort of things that I want to say. You may not agree with them. I know we have people who are be talked about in this presentation. They're here, and they might think I mistook them completely, but that's what Mats said. You can say, I disagree with you. Odom, in 1998, said a common agreed upon definition of inclusion does not exist, and in fact, the terminology has changed over the years. I will preface my presentation by saying, and it continues to evolve, because the starting point of inclusion is, what is it, and how has it been defined? So I will give you a few examples, just to get a sense of what is there, and then we can use that as a framework for saying what might need to be done, and what are some of these things that you might want to be talking about this afternoon. And these are just representative presentations from different parts of the world, so I've indicated sort of who was the author and where they come from. But the definition, as you can see, supporting children with disabilities in everyday settings or natural environments. Immediately we have to talk about, well, what are those natural environments? What are those everyday settings? And a recent paper from some people in the Czech Republic, and you can see here children with special needs having a chance to learn together with their peers, and to learn in a heterogeneous group. Note a part of social learning, and this I found this interesting. Is one of the definitions actually bring into theory. Many of the definitions lack any kind of theoretical framework. And then you can see also talking about the fact that this is a safe place and promotes their intervention. Inclusion with children with disabilities in typical neighborhood and community activities. For many of us, certainly for me, and I don't do really any research in this area, but I had always thought about inclusion as sort of downward extension of the inclusion in special education, which is usually inclusion in the educational environment. But here's this typical neighborhood and community activities. Of course, it could be many different things. And if we really define inclusion and say, what does it do? How does it accomplish the interventions on behalf of children? We need to know what that is. Kim, let's talk about the right of children with disabilities to access and participate in early childhood environments. Settings that was acknowledged to be the foundation of inclusion. Well, what might be the basis? And those are just the sample. I could have 20 of them for you, but I decided not to do it that way or put it in my usual way of putting it in the matrix. I love matrices, but it doesn't work for this. So it's better to give you this subjective kind of perspective. So what is the basis? Well, I think it's not unreasonable to say that probably this emerged out of the U.S. as one of the contributions, because that's where the Individuals with Disabilities Act first brought this in. And of course, it's important to remember that even to this day, inclusion as a word is not found in those public policies. The least restrictive environment are. But in this case, the principles defining inclusion emerged from the fact that this was free and public, which it should be. I won't resist the temptation to talk. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Individualized education plans, the fact that it's individualized and made available for the child, and specifically then that it is accomplished in the least restrictive environment. Of course, here again, we have, well, what is least restrictive? Well, it depends on the child. What are the child characteristics? And then responsibilities of the state to implement those policies. So these three basic principles evolved over time, and I still remember my own experience as a one-year teacher in special education. That was before these laws were in place. And it was kind of like, sort of, here's a room, we boarded up the back of the auditorium and said, here are some leftover materials from other classrooms, and here are 10 children with varying kinds of problems. Go at it. And it was one of the most interesting years I've ever had in my life. I'd like to go back to it now, that I think I maybe know something else. But it was truly a place where we did not have any of these concepts. But yet, clearly, at that moment, that was perhaps the least restrictive environment for that child, because they weren't functioning well in the typical environment. With the progression of these laws and successive reauthorizations, The words first came into mainstreaming, integration, and ultimately into inclusion. And they have taken on a life of their own, which they do, and people often use them, as I'm doing, as if we all know what it means. And that's why I started with the definition. So, trying to tease it apart a little bit and saying, well, what are the elements? What are people putting into those definitions? And in some cases, identifying what are the elements and what was the definition really is kind of separate. But I wanted you to get an idea of what I was thinking about. And so when I come to sort of the conclusion of my talk, why did I say those things? Mainstream schools should work to become schools for all. So we have the broader universal agenda of education for all that was spearheaded by the UN and its various implications, and subsequently, of course, the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. The idea is that can we have schools for everyone? But in this case, the idea of the elements being, is it full or part-time, variety of forms of support, three-tier system, mixed, special, and so forth. I mean, these are a lot of words in there, and yet it doesn't define what they are, and are they really present as part of that inclusive environmental effort. Predis in Austria mentioned the fact that integration is seen as a personal effort with a person with disability. I don't know exactly what that means in terms of, and again, I want to emphasize that none of you should take this, and I hope if the person ever who presented these ideas would take offense. I'm not criticizing them, but I'm saying they have a lot of important information. They're noble ideals about what we should do. But in order to make something work, in order to determine if it works, if it's successful, as if it achieves the things that we want for the children, it should be clear and definable. And I think that's, again, what I understand we'll be doing in this conference. So the differentiation here that he says is integration is this personal effort, but inclusion is a quality relating to the system that enables education for all. And the U.S. Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services had a major document that many of you are familiar with. But this is a very inclusive and inclusive statement. I have to be careful of using that. But you see here that the element of the fact that it's children being in situations with other, with peers that do not have a disability, but then you add these things, but holding high expectations and intentionally promoting participation in all learning and social activities facilitated by individual accommodations to foster development, friendship with peers and a sense of belonging. And that's a huge order. Now, those are all the elements. And the question is, how are they operationalized? How do they put in place? And are they, in fact, possible all in one way? And that's the hope, again, the thing that you need to be talking about. The work from Israel. Inclusion of a child with special needs, a preschool of typically developing children, all day, often accompanied by one-to-one support, partial inclusion, for part of the day or week, most of the time is spent with children with special needs, and specialized program having, so again, Mats was talking about the concept of time, and time has been one of the most favorite dependent variables that we have, time to do something, and yet does that really capture what it is we're talking about? Time and space is the important ingredient. So at any moment, what you and I do, what the child does, is defined by time and space, and we need to figure out how to do that. So, moving along quickly. I can't believe this. I was going to figure out how do I integrate all this information. So Goranek came to my aid, and he had a recent paper in which he said, here are the 4 goals. And I thought, well, didn't you develop a model? What is this? Where are you coming with these goals? But they seem to make sense, and they provided me with an entree into thinking about how to say what should count as evidence. Florian had a recent paper on what counts as evidence in special education inclusion. She developed a model that has some elements to it, a very systematic way, but it really wasn't designed for working with children, but the question is the right one. What should count as evidence? And oftentimes we count the evidence, first of all, we count the things that we're interested in, we also count the things that are relatively easier and for which there are measures. One of the things that I think the field of inclusion, inclusive policy, we just need to see a lot more measures that really are sensitive to all those broad frameworks that we discussed both in the definition and in the essential element. And it's important, and we look at what is the evidence, that there's a differentiation between the evidence for the means, which in the context of Guralnick's goals, access is a means. Accommodations are means to inclusion, whereas ends are the developmental progress of the child and the social integration. Now, if I asked you to come up with goals, you might have more, but the point here is that in the field, in the literature, in all the papers that I brought with me, that I probably will leave somewhere because it's too heavy to carry back, many, many different measurement tools. And oftentimes there's not this differentiation. And sure, there might be situations where we need to have the evidence to define the means. But ultimately, inclusion is about the ends. That is, does the child develop more successfully? Does the child have a sense of well-being? Are they accepted? Are they having a meaningful role in that particular sphere of their life? And I'll use niche. I like that. All right, so again, just selective examples. And of course, they violate every principle of bias because I picked the ones I like. First rule of meta-analysis is you're supposed to be very careful about ruling out all possible biases, and I will admit mine. But for an access goal, this is a paper from China, which I'm just summarizing what was the kind of research and the appropriate kind of research with numbers and analyses. The differential engagement and interaction of children with disabilities with adults and peers found to vary as a function of the type of activity and the kind of lesson format. In this case, breaking down something which is very routine in the room. But if we are to understand the child's engagement, the child's role in that situation, and if we look to evidence, that's the level at which we need to have the data. There were many, many papers which looked at issues, but they failed to differentiate between this, what I call the means and the ends. Another means is the accommodation feasibility goal. And you think about, and this was an interesting paper using a logic model, and it was very much sort of a structural analysis, how to improve the child's engagement in the environment by using a logic model to systemize the process of inclusion. And in this framework, by using this logic model, they maintained that it impacted both the short and the long-term outcomes for children and their caregivers, a very systemizing way to do it. What about the goals? A developmental progress goal. Language peers in an inclusive environment found to predict language growth of children. Very interesting paper in which they systematically did an analysis of what was the nature of the language that was produced by the children, all of the children in the environment, and looking specifically at the impact of that language environment over time and the effects on children. And very interesting interaction between these, if you will, the ambient language environment of the peers without disabilities and the way in which that was acquired by incidental learning in the language acquisition of children with disabilities. Social integration, wonderful paper. We should have just had someone here present that one. But the social acceptance of children with disabilities by typically developing peers and inclusive environment. was impacted by the child characteristics, and in this case by younger age and severity of disability. And of course, for so much of the time, special education, disability studies, all the work that we all do, we've always been very focused on defining the child. And even at this point, so much of the research continues to try to look further and further inside the child, the brain research. And of course, I think somebody in around the world is looking for that elusive gene to solve the autism problem. Heaven knows there's so much effort and so much money directed to that problem. But my point is that we also need to remember that there are aspects of that dimension that are very crucial in defining the interaction of the child with that environment. So, let me give you an example of evidence, and this is just an example, but it gets to the issue that I've been trying to talk about, which is clarifying the relationship between what it is that we're talking about doing, what is part of the definition, what is part of the elements, and what are the things we're measuring. In this case, the annual report to Congress on IDEA produces comprehensive report on what's happening in the U.S. based on the data that each state sends back. And in this case, in a very narrow frame, this is such a small part, but we get back to the issue about time. Time is a convenient marker, but in this case, time is a fairly broad variable. It is quantified, but in this case, under IDEA, and as the U.S. government is requesting the information for inclusion, they've defined it in terms of these 7 dimensions. So, what part of the time do they participate in the regular class or the regular preschool environment? At least 10 hours a week, in which the majority is there with disabilities. I got the there in here. But in this case, so the child spends at least 10 hours a week, and they are in a situation where the majority are children without disabilities. A central but often overlooked point when we talk about inclusion, that is, the child is included in an environment that has more of children that have more skills than they do. At least 10 hours a week, the majority is somewhere else. It's a funny language, but the idea is they're there, but that doesn't constitute, so in other words, there's not a critical mass that have more skills than they do. And of course, the model here goes back to special ed, where there is no inclusion. Everybody has variable skills, but there's not a critical mass that has greater skills. Less than 10 hours a week, majority there without disability, less than 10 hours a week, majority elsewhere. Then other environments, separate class, separate school, residential facility, home service provider location. And these are fairly small. I don't know, when I was printing this, I don't know, the numbers disappeared. Remember, this is the wrong order. Okay, I'm going to get this one. Here we are. And I'll come back to the other one. Percentage of children served under IDEA in the fall of 2014. And fundamentally, you can see here that the 10 hours a week majority is about 40-some%. That's the red part. Then 10 hours a week majority elsewhere accounts for about 17%. And then the green one, which is the separate class. So there's still a fairly substantial part of that. And so if we want to think about the 10 hours a week with majority elsewhere, 10 hours a week with majority there, that accounts for more than about 60%, and the remainder are more traditional kinds of settings. So this gets back to the issue about when we talk not about full inclusion as 10 hours per week with the majority, but full inclusion as a broad concept. What does that mean? Because there are policy initiatives that will have full inclusion, but basically in this case it means full inclusion on a spectrum of services. So then let's see, who are the children in these settings in the preschool? Now, what we didn't have in this annual report, it was available in earlier studies for school-age children in special education, where you can actually find out who is in the inclusive environment. In this case, this is only defining the preschool population, but the majority of them are speech and language children. Then the developmental delay accounts for the remainder. And surprisingly, I think for me, but not surprising because we're seeing this continuing, escalating proportion of children with autism. And that other little sphere accounts for all the other disabilities combined. Certainly, again, when we think about the conference that Mats was talking about, when at least some of us were doing some of our earlier work, that sliver was 1% or less. And the 10% was children with intellectual disabilities, etc. So, anyway, I wanted to just give you an idea about the variability of definitions, because as there are international variability in definitions, variability in elements of inclusion, there's huge variability in the U.S. And in this case, the children who are, you can just, in this case, use as a proxy for where are the kids and where are they being included, if you will. And basically, you can see here that there are, we took the 5 lowest states, Texas, Alabama, District of Columbia, Georgia, Colorado, where, depending on the year, but broadly, about 4 to 5% are of the 3 to 5-year-olds in that state are in some kind of preschool and inclusive environment, whereas the other states that we've listed here are ranging in the proportion of children who are served in preschool, early intervention, or early childhood programs, and they remain fairly consistent over time. And at this point, I'm not even sure why there's so much variability in what the proportions are, but they are sometimes accounted for by population moves and so forth. And also, of course, the available social system that determines who might be in, who might be out, depending on those kind of criteria. This one I already did. Okay, so what are some inclusive policy? What are some of the issues? What do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So, first of all, the problem of defining inclusion as time in the setting. And as I said before, it's sort of the one that the U.S. government's working with. It's a lot what other people are working with, but it's a very gross marker. And it's even a question of, is that really the important one? We need research to find out, is it how much, the intensity of the dose, if you will. Is it more to have sort of a low-level program for an hour or high intensity? Those are questions we need to ask. The idea of full inclusion, not full inclusion operationalized as 10 hours a week, but full inclusion in a broader sense. What does it mean for a child? And then, of course, the variations, because you have a continuum. As it is, of course, there continues to be low rates of inclusion of students with more severe disabilities, greater needs, and the evidence of inclusion effectiveness related to the assumptions. If you think about some of the most broad assumptions about high expectations and so forth, all of those that have to do with accommodations, that kind of evidence we don't have very much. So, let me just move on because I got a few more slides. I'm making sure. So in the absence of agreed upon specific model, a variety of models have been produced, but there needs to be a synthesis of existing models or existing knowledge in the development of a universal model of inclusion incorporating particularly relevant theory. In other words, it seemed that if we look back, and as I've tried to trace to you in my biased way, that the underlying premise for inclusion was not theoretical or conceptual. It had to do with a principle. And in this case, if we want to test the efficacy of something, it's often good to have a theory that we can utilize as part of that testing. So, develop these conceptions of inclusion that reflect the essential elements of the policy. Assumptions related to the interaction of the child with the environment that has access. engagement. And the social learning theory, that is, what does the child get out of that? What is the child's sort of drawing from that environment to achieve their developmental goals? And of course, these are always complex questions. There's no question about that. So we can implement and evaluate evidence, utilize evidence-based strategies in regular preschool environment settings that might vary on these continuum. Delivery of specialized instruction. Now, inclusion still has a primary goal to impart knowledge to the child. Now, the child acquires in different ways. It's different from the special education environment or for the regular education environment, but it still has a goal to promote the education of the child and then to document in appropriate ways. Many times, and this is perfectly appropriate because all of us do it, I do it myself, but we're very big fans of Bronfenbrenner. We're also fans of Samaroff, but we've sort of forgotten him. And let me just mention here that it's not about who these two people are, but Bronfenbrenner provides an inclusive, well, there we go again, model in which is the embeddedness of a child in different systems, but doesn't really get at the interactive nature. That is, what has happened at a given moment in time and a place that is defined as engagement or participation or doing something or learning something. And there's a lot of models, and Samaroff had this one. I always liked it, so I always use it. But the point is that we really need much more sophisticated models that take apart the pieces that have to do with what is the nature of that. And I always have this temptation to develop something called the complex helix, in which we think about elements of the child and elements of the environment, and it's that interaction that really defines it at any given moment in time, and that's constantly changing. So anyway, one of my favorite ideas, and it just came back to me again when I was reading all this stuff, because I thought, inclusion is all about environments. And the environment is so poorly defined. In this case, it's an inclusive environment, 10 hours a week, whatever. What's in there? And many, many years ago, Barker and Wright, this was very popular theory, but very laborious because it required doing things by hand. Now we have the wonderful technology. Kids can wear things like I am doing, map what I'm doing, wear braces, make videos, and so forth. But in this case, we have the opportunity to really get at the idea of behavioral settings, the behavior milieu phenomenon, that is, at any given moment in time, and I'm using their examples, but a specific set of time, place, and objects that provides a standing problem of behavior. So every child in an inclusive environment is in this behavioral setting, and it has certain props. And we have to figure out what are the important props. And what are the things that are going to make a difference? And of course, usually those are tested in single model studies in which we do a logic model or we provide the children with some gadget or tool or whatever. But the idea here is that as revisiting not the whole, but the idea of a systematic eco-behavioral approach to how we look at inclusion. And this is one of my favorite pictures, but to remind ourselves, not from our perspective, from the child. Now, in order to consider what is in that environment, we have to, of course, decide what it may be that the child, but we can also do that by knowing that, in one of the studies I mentioned, kids were much more engaged depending on where they were. What was the type of activity? What was the setting? And in this case, we don't have to draw these things, but that may be what we then decide what should be there, in addition to the most important, the two most important people, maybe the most important, is the peer, and then the adult. But then there are all the props. And we don't know, sometimes some of the props may be more important than the child, but that's the kind of research we need to do. You're going to pull the plug. All right. So, anyway, drawing on that, the concept of goodness fit. The less competent person, the greater the influence in the environment. The higher the competence of the person, the better able the person to utilize. And those are things that have to do with these gradations of inclusion environment. Okay. Have a look at Siegel's book on the interpersonal neurobiology, because he brings a very nice relationship between the environment, which is really where all of our relationships come, and the mind, which is regulating our behavior, and the brain, which Mats just showed us here. So, okay. Let me conclude then by saying that I think if we do, and we are, and I think that the very presence of all of you here today really talks about the fact that we are all engaged, and this is a universal agenda on behalf of children. And to do that, we need to improve the level and quality of clinical implication, that is, matching what it is we said in our definitions, what are the elements, to actually what is going on. To improve the rigor of the research, and again, to really recognize what are the elements of the environment that are crucial, that we need to document, that are going to make the change. All right, so I think that's fine. You can read this, and it will be available on the website. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rune.
Time is my problem.
Looking on, yeah, it is. It's for all of us, I think.
Time and space.
Yeah. That was time spent in high engagement. And we'll probably have more of that. So, Dale,
Yeah.
I think I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Why?
Otherwise,
Okay. All right.
I say that Dale can introduce herself. That makes it a little bit, we'll use less time for introduction. I just want to say that Dale is the person that I know that has spent most time actually looking into classrooms to see what's happening on a very detailed level.
Yeah, it's
We
very depressing.
using her methods now, and we learn a lot from it.
Yeah.
So, Dale Farron.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. And I think I may go back the farthest with Rune. We team taught together, and I feel like I'm back 40 years. That's how long it's been. Following him again in a classroom that looked a lot like this. So it's a real pleasure for me to be back. These are people I admire enormously. So it's going to seem as though what I'm talking about is quite different from what Mats and Rune talked about earlier. But in fact, if you'll bear with me, I think you'll see some similar themes that we need to think about in a broader way. So I have been deeply involved in the move in the U.S. toward having more state funding for what we call public pre-K programs. And it's very important for me to make clear to you, especially in Sweden. I remember a intense discussion I had with Mats about this a few years ago, because you in Sweden, for example, provide access to childcare from, I think it's something like 80% of your 2-year-olds are in care. That is not the case in the U.S., so our programs tend to be targeted. A few states have what we would call universal, but our programs, if you will, are targeted toward children from low-income families, which means, in a sense, they're just another population to disabilities. So it is an excluded population, and that is not part of a universal system. So I think it's really important to understand that when we look at the effects that these programs have had. So let's start with what we know about prior research. Just in general, I think we've all been saying here the same theme, which is that the pre-K age in particular is a very developmentally sensitive period. And we've only in the last 30 or 40 years begun to think about what sort of environments children should be in that period of 0 to 5 or 6 that is apart from their families, and to sort of be thinking about what we should provide for them. But those experiences can have profound and lasting effects on children. People are really interested in issues of toxic stress right now and how that may play out in health problems when you're in your 50s and 60s. There's the fetal origins hypothesis about exposure you may have in utero that actually may show up when you're hypertension and all sorts of heart problems when you're in your 60s. So we know we need to pay attention to this age period. So the idea is that high quality experiences in this age period could really potentially enrich your experiences and in ways that might be lasting for you. And so we need to be thinking about that. But the environments, at least in the US, are not providing predictability, stability, and experiences that may be necessary for long-term development during this sensitive period. In part, we had a good discussion about this yesterday in terms of looking at some indices of poverty around the world. The United States looks good. But if you look at the index of the distance between the rich and the poor, we're one of the worst countries. We have one of the biggest gaps between impoverished people and wealthy people. So as an impoverished family, you're quite aware of the distance between what you have and have access to compared to other people in the country. So Sean Reardon, this is the age of big data. I love it, but okay. So Sean Reardon has done this incredible mapping. This is every single county in the U.S., which is a small administrative unit in the U.S., in terms of the degree of poverty. You don't need to know exactly what those colors are, but you know that the more colors you have, the more poor you are, all right? So you can look at this swath that goes across, particularly where we live, the southern states, and then up around through Texas and through the western states, and then up where that's where we have a great deal of concentrated poverty. Now, what's interesting is the next map, which maps educational attainment. And tell me if you see any difference between those two maps. So we have now a very strong link in the U.S. that's getting stronger between poor educational attainment and poverty. And if you go back to what Runa was talking about, a free and appropriate public education, we're dismantling that system. And so one would say, yes, this educational system may be free for poor children. It's obviously not appropriate, because they're not making progress, right? There's a strong link between what's available to them educationally and the impoverishment of their families. So, the idea is, this is not necessarily logical. Pre-K will be the answer, and so this gets back to some of the issues that Mats and Runa both talked about, that I'll try to be clever in thinking about what I'm talking to you and make those connections. So in the U.S. pre-kindergarten programs, there are assumptions behind this, which is that we assume that the reason we're having these poor educational outcomes long term is that poor children are entering the schools less ready to learn. They're less prepared. So this actually emerged in the 60s as a theory that what we need to do is line children up to the same starting point at kindergarten, and then they will be effective participants in the K-12 system. And so we need to remediate those deficits in the pre-K years so that they can be competitive when they go to school. If you think about this, this is very much a blame the victim mentality. This says the issue is the problems is within the child, and that we need to fix those problems and get that child more ready to learn. But this whole change from the 60s, I couldn't resist, goes back to a relatively new idea that was in the 60s, that intelligence and education was actually malleable. So Intelligence and Experience was this groundbreaking book by J. McVicker Hunt. And it was coincidental with some early university-based experimental programs you may have heard of, the Perry Preschool program. I say Darcy because that was Susan Gray, who was at Vanderbilt. The Abecedarian program, which was at UNC Chapel Hill. I won't go into all these. There's some great stories about Rick Heber in Milwaukee. Then Head Start was authorized in 1964. Title I, which is our support for elementary and secondary education, was reauthorized in 1986 to allow money to be spent for pre-K programs in the public schools. State funding, now state money independent of the federal money, has been scaling up since the 1990s. And in 2014, the U.S. Department of Education invested millions in public school pre-K programs to be run by the schools, by departments of education. So how successful are these programs? Well, if we go back to the Perry Preschool and the Abecedarian program, first of all, I have to acknowledge Greg Duncan and Catherine Magnuson for this wonderful analysis. And I can give you that citation if you're interested. So this is in what's called effect sizes. And so you don't have to know about effect sizes, though many of you may. But bigger is better. Okay, and as you get toward 1, that's really a standard deviation difference between the treated and the untreated. So that's a pretty strong effect. And so Perry Preschool had an effect size of a little more than 1, Abecedarian about 0.9. So those are strong programs. So can we replicate those programs? Well, they were implemented in the U.S. in the 60s and 70s. They were small. They were in a single location. They were very intense, and they were heavily guided by on-site, very invested researchers. I spent 10 years with the Abecedarian program. It's seldom mentioned, the fact that in our infant and toddler program on that same floor, we had 2 pediatricians and a nurse practitioner. Try to replicate that today. Anyway, these were much more extensive interventions, and the Abecedarian program was seamless. The children entered at 6 weeks, and they stayed until they went to kindergarten. And it worked. It was it was open 10 hours a day, 11 months a year, and so it was a full working day, not a school day. The other point is that the counterfactual has changed. So counterfactual means, what are you comparing to? So if you're having pre-K as an intervention for poor children, which is how it's being viewed, it's an intervention for poor children, then it's an intervention compared to what? To what they would get if they weren't in pre-K, right? So if they weren't in pre-K during the Abecedarian and Perry Preschool time, they were in very different environments from children today. First of all, school systems were even more segregated then. We're resegregating, but they were highly segregated then by race. Second, we didn't have public kindergarten programs. We didn't have Sesame Street. There are multiple things that have changed that children are being exposed to today that they were not being exposed to in the 60s and 70s. Nonetheless, these are the studies. If you go onto any website in the U.S., any policy program, anything that the states put out, that the federal government puts out, these are the studies that are cited to say this is why we should invest in pre-K. I'm infamous, not famous, infamous for saying these are spinach, but we can't afford spinach, so let's give them Easter grass and see if it works as well. So this is a really interesting point. So since Perry and Abecedarian, as we have tried to implement more and more pre-K programs, we're having less and less effect. So by the 2000s, we were down at effect sizes of, this is just for pre-K, this is just across the pre-K year, this is not long term, of about 0.35 versus, so we were 1/3 of the effect that we had in the Abecedarian and preschool and Perry preschool programs. There are 2 randomized control trials of scaled up programs. And these are waiting list designs. So children apply, families apply to have their children attend. There's not enough space for all of them. They're accepted in a randomized order, and then those for whom there's not enough space become the control group. There are two of those. One of them was the Head Start Impact Study. That was a national study, because Head Start is a national program. There's about 3,000 children in that. The other is my own study with Mark Lipsey, the Tennessee Voluntary Pre-K program, 10 VPK, and we have about 3,000 children in that too. It's the same sort of waiting list design, but it's only in the state of Tennessee. But it's the only study of state-funded public pre-K that's a randomized control trial. Our findings are remarkably similar. We get about the same impact at the end of the pre-K year, about 0.35, on easily measured skills, with stronger effects on early literacy. We get immediate fade out of effects by kindergarten. So as the Head Start Impact people said in their report, Puma said, the children in the control group gained in 1 year what it took the children in the treatment group to gain in 2 years. And in terms of longer term effect, the Head Start Impact study found no effects by the end of 3rd grade. We, on the other hand, have found actual negative effects. So Head Start is not in public preschools. All of the studies, 94% of the classrooms that are in our study are in elementary schools. They are classrooms in elementary schools. We found negative effects on achievement beginning in 2nd grade. So the children who had not attended pre-K began to do better than the children who had attended pre-K in 2nd grade and consistently in 3rd grade. And this is the effects are notable on math and science. But also what's happening now is by the end of 3rd grade, the children who had participated in pre-K are having more disciplinary infractions. Now, they're not the major disciplinary infractions like fighting or bringing a weapon to school, which we have in the U.S., I'm sorry to say. They are things that really have to do with school attitude. So wearing your hat backwards, talking back to a teacher, not getting out of the hallway, the kinds of things that connote a poorer attitude towards school. We're beginning to see an increased rate for children who had been in school a year earlier as 4-year-olds. So there are issues here. I got 1 minute. Part of the issues is we don't have a consensus really about what the goals are for pre-K. If the goals are to reduce the achievement gap in the short term, no, this is back to what Runa was saying. Whatever the goals you have for your children should determine the kind of program, and you should evaluate your program on the basis of your goals. But if you don't have consensus about what your goals are, then it's really hard to figure out what your program should be. So if your goal is reduce the achievement gap, then these pre-K programs are doing exactly what you want them to do if it's short term. So at kindergarten entry, these children are looking okay. But if your goal is to reduce the achievement gap long term on long-term outcomes, these programs are not doing very well. If your goal is to reduce poverty, which is a lot of people talk about, at least in the US, and create better educated workers by providing this 9 months of pre-K, then we have to follow these children long term and see if we're actually getting that. And the cues from our data are that we will likely not get those outcomes. The other issue is some people talk about pre-K as a support for families. It's clearly not a support for families if it operates 6 hours a day, 9 months a year. So there's a lack of clarity in the U.S. about who should be responsible for young children. Should it be the public schools, which is increasingly becoming the case, or should it be Health and Human Services, which might have a very different orientation? And then how should pre-K itself relate to what is becoming increasingly a broken K-12 system serving poor children? So if you don't fix those schools that children are going to, why are you putting the burden on children to be prepared to achieve in schools that are not helping people achieve very well? So I would say with no shared coherent vision about the problem, there's little clarity in the U.S. about what role pre-K should play. But this afternoon, I'm going to focus on creating better, and well, actually tomorrow afternoon I'm going to focus on creating better environments. This afternoon I'm going to be talking about why I think these kinds of environments may not allow the kind of participation and engagement by children that would actually facilitate their development. Thank you.
Dale, thank you so much. Very good, and it's actually leading into the next presenter, which is Ana Pinto from Porto University in Portugal. And in Porto, you just started with a new system for the preschools. And it's actually maybe sometimes better to be one of the last ones to start that, because you can learn from the mistakes of the ones who were earlier on. So I think some of the issues that Dale talked about and also Rune will actually be addressed by Anna, and they are working very much in an active research, action research context. Anna?
Thank you. Oh, good morning. I thought, okay, yeah. Thank you for inviting me to share some ideas. Thank you, Mats. I was challenged to speak about research on engagement and preschool environment in our country. So I will be sharing 17 years of experience in research on engagement in Porto, in the University of Porto, that our team has been developing through these years. We started with the first, well, this should be in phases, but we started in 2000 with that first quality of child interactions in family and daycare, with typically developing children aged 0 to 6 years old, and we wanted to study engagement as based on the bioecological theory and transactional theory. We wanted to study engagement as operationalization of the proximal processes that occur between the child and the environment in daycare and family. Of course, in their interactions. What we found in this first project was that there were some child variables like temperament and adaptive behavior that influenced the engagement, child engagement in their care, but also contextual variables such as the adult's directiveness, responsiveness, and degree of warmth towards the children that was influencing their interaction both in family and daycare. Actually, we found that engagement in family moderated engagement in daycare. This is broad because I cannot go further. Then we thought to follow these children when they were 3 to 6, to see how their engagement evolved in preschool. One of the things that we found was the directness of the adults was a negative predictor of engagement, but also we added a typical developing group of children. And what did we found? We found that the children spend a lot of time with the adults rather than with the children. And although they might be in higher engagement with the adults, they were in very, very low engagement with the other peers, but also rarely engaged with peer. So this raised our curiosity to start in 2000 another project in which Runa, Mats and Eva were consultants that wanted to just look at children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And I might go back a little to tell you about inclusion in Portugal, because as Mats was saying, we did not incur in maybe some of the mistakes of other countries. We have inclusion, at least the children are there. We don't have special schools. All the children from 0 to 6 are in preschool. So we might say that we have a space inclusion in terms of space and time. They can be there the whole time. But what are they doing whilst they are there? We started noticing in the 2005 project that sometimes they were not doing anything. They could be in the corner of the room, or as we found, just engaging with the support teacher. So we based our research on participation and engagement based on the ICFCY framework, just with these children with disabilities in preschool. And we found that, well, actually that children did not, we found that there were three big dimensions on participation, and they were engagement, how children were involved while they were there. Then another dimension that had to do with social relations, that is how they saw the context in terms of relating with peers. And the other one was independence, meaning how they could express in performance their activity capacities, if you know what I mean. So, broadly. And then finally, we wanted to further investigate participation and engagement with all children, meaning that we wanted to have typically developing children at risk, because we have a lot of poverty and children that may not be identified for support, but they are there. And we wanted to know what they were doing in terms of participation and engagement, but also children that had been having support or identified by services to have support. I will talk more about this last project, which is the more recent one that is in inclusive preschool settings, and it is an international study that we are sharing with Sweden and South Africa and some other countries. So these are the broad project goals. We wanted to describe and compare preschool environments. And we wanted to analyze these two dimensions of participation that Mats talked about. Time and variety of activities that children were involved in, and their involvement, the core and developmental engagement. Then we wanted also to investigate the role of the classroom process qualities on these outcomes, and to analyze transactional effects between child characteristics, process characteristics of the quality, and participation processes. These are the three time moments of time data collections, as it is a longitudinal study. These are the participants. It's 246, I think. 7 participants that were characterized in three big groups. Children with disabilities that were receiving special education supports in the classroom. That's what we do with the support. It should be within the inclusive classrooms. And then the other two groups that were not receiving support, although the children at risk were identifying as having difficulties in the classroom by their preschool teachers. So, this will be the three groups that we will be talking about. In this slide, you can see the measures that we used, and they are divided in 4 dimensions. We assessed process quality in terms of the classroom aspects, teacher and child interactions, global quality, and then participation components like the time and variety of activities, core engagement, developmental engagement, and some child characteristics that might influence engagement, such as developmental functioning, self-regulation, and finally we had dimensions about family. Some of the real results. Do I have time? Yeah, okay. So, how did the children spend their time? As you can see, children spend most of their time, all children spend most of their time, the whole group, nearly 50% in whole group structured activities. And the same happened with the children that received support. So it was the same pattern for all children. Then when you looked at the focus of learning, well, as you can see, it's more than 50% because we have other and none. There was no focus of activity for the children, and both for children and for the teacher. Sorry, this was the none, which is also, well, none and other. When we look at the children with disabilities or at the other group, it was exactly the same pattern, that the focus was none most of the time. Well, here, nearly 50% of the time. Broadly, then we wanted to look at participation time in activities and diversity of activities, but also at core engagement, meaning the interest, belonging, and the attention and well-being dimension of engagement. Here you can see that when we look at the three groups, overall, children with disabilities have lower engagement when compared with the other two groups as expected. But when we look at cooperative play, you can see that both children with disabilities and children at risk have lower engagement in cooperative play when compared with the typically developing children. When you look then at effects of classroom quality on child engagement, core engagement, we saw that the tone of the teacher had an impact on engagement, and well, the level of instruction did not have an impact. And we analyzed it, and we thought that it might be because there was no high inferential learning found in the observed classrooms. So that might be the reason why the level of instruction did not have an impact on children's engagement. Anyway, the tone, the better the tone, the higher children's engagement. Children with disabilities in this case. When we look at effects as measured by the class, it's another measure for the quality of the classroom in terms of processes. We see that both the global score, but also the emotional and emotional support and classroom organization have an impact on engagement, a positive impact on engagement, and just a marginal effect on the associative play with peers, meaning the higher, the better engagement, and the higher associative play with peers. If we look down, now we are trying to look at transactional relations between child characteristics, classroom characteristics, and of course transactional, participation processes. And when we looked at these three groups of children, as you can see, we found we started with children's characteristics, and we thought, well, let's see how self-regulation works for engagement. And as you can see, for children, the three groups of children, there is a moderation effect of self-regulation in the relationship between developmental functioning and engagement, indicating that for children with disabilities, the self-relation could be, pivotal. Because, as you see, it is it impacts a lot engagement for children with disabilities. So it may be even more important for children with disabilities. Okay, this will be the next step to analyze further these transactional effects between child characteristics and interactive processes in the classroom and process quality through time. So we tried to share with you our research. We started with engagement as a developmental indicator of children in context, as depicting proximal processes. Then we went to study engagement as a participant component in inclusive settings, and then we depicted engagement as a multidimensional construct with core and developmental engagement. And now we thought that it is a challenge to think how can we, accounting for core engagement, how can we operationalize developmental engagement. So that is something that we are working hard on. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for going into the classroom. And I think that's very much where we have to go. And now, we're leaving the classroom partly. Yes. with Juan, who is from South Africa. We've been collaborating for I don't know how many years.
20.
Juan used to be a postdoc with me and Eva at Mälardalen University more than 15 years ago.
Closer to 20.
Yeah, closer to 20, she said. Yeah. Juan is working very much with AAC and alternative communication, and we're actually collaborating together with Christine Ames and people here, Karina, with something called PMP, Picture My Participation, where we try to find a way to let children have their own voice in rating their participation in poor environment. Juan?
Thank you. Okay, so as Mats was saying, we're leaving the classroom and now we're heading for the court system. Okay, so if we really think about this, child abuse is something that has an impact that lasts a lifetime for a child. And that is exactly why it is so important for us at a conference like this that wants to focus on child development to really look at what happens here so that we really think about engagement in its broadest sense. If we think about the consequences of abuse, we know that it's there at a very physiological level, that it's there at an emotional level that has short-term emotional impacts such as fear and isolation, but also impacts socially that last over a lifetime. Fear of having proper relationships, all kinds of behavioral issues later, substance abuse, delinquency, different things that can happen. So in this presentation, I thought that we would quickly talk a little bit about what child abuse is, then to talk about why children's rights matter and how that can help and focus on protection of children, and then to discuss preschool children's participation in the criminal justice system. And the fun thing is that we will be doing all of this in only 20 minutes. So hold on, here we go. So if we think about children's rights, child abuse is unfortunately not a recent phenomenon. It is something that has been with us for generations, and that really stemmed initially, we think, from harsh forms of discipline, which was seen not only as a parent's right, but also as a parent's responsibility. And for many years, corporal punishment was unfortunately seen as the best way in which you can discipline children. And very often this was done by people who were ill-equipped to know how to discipline children. In the 50s, there was then all of a sudden this awareness of children that really needed protection. When things were starting to see like children with broken long bones, with hematomas, and people started realizing that protection is really needed. The media then became very interested in this, and they obviously focused on the most bizarre and severe cases. And they started investigating the effect of socioeconomic risk factors and multi-stressed, multi-problem families, and that led to this hype around the battered child syndrome. Now, of course, that did serve some purpose, but that was unfortunately only a part of the problem, because unfortunately, child abuse is a much more complex phenomenon than only trying to divide people into child abusers and non-abusers. So the focus more recently has really shifted to look at child abuse that does not discriminate based on gender. It does not discriminate in terms of social standing, ethnicity, or religion. So these days we really realize that we need a much more multidimensional perspective. So if we look at maltreatment of children and abuse in children, we know that there's lots of different definitions. There's some legal definitions, there's social definitions, but for now I will just go with the one of the World Health Organization that sort of divided it into these 5 broad categories, talking firstly about physical abuse. So that would be all of these terrible punching, beating, kicking, burning, breaking bones. And we also know that when we see these are typically affected to areas of the body that's not generally visible. Okay, so it would be on places where clothes would cover it. And also the difference between seeing this and children that just get hurt during regular play activities is that very often it's in different places. Okay, so that's one of the easiest ways in which one can be aware of what's happening. Then we also know that it really talks about things like neglect, inadequate nutrition, inadequate clothing, not protecting the children, medical neglect, leaving children in cars unattended. And in countries like ours, where the heat is very often there, it really is problematic if a child is left unattended in a car. Sexual abuse, and here it really ranges all of the way from grooming children and making them prepared to rape. Exploitation, and we see that the World Health Organization really had to add a whole new section that really talks about making pornographic material, and as well as prostitution in children, and then also emotional abuse. And that is the marked inattention when a child really needs that attention and you withholding that. Also domestic abuse in front of children so that they just have to witness what is happening in a family. A lot of people say that childhood abuse is very often not something that only affects 1 or 2 individual children. It is something that affects the whole household and everybody living together. And then also this idea of permission to use substances such as drugs and alcohol at an age where children should not be exposed to that. And then I really didn't know how else to name this, but to call it some scary statistics, because that really is ultimately what it is. If we look at statistics at Sweden, it talks about 10% of children that have experienced violence in the home of some form, 21% of adolescents that have experienced sexual abuse. And then it becomes even more scarier when we go to the South African context, where 35% of young people interviewed in schools had said that they had experienced some form of sexual abuse. If we look globally, we see that when we compare children with disabilities to children without disabilities, children with disabilities are twice as likely to be on the receiving end of abuse. And if we look on the whole sphere of disability, children with severe physical disabilities and a communication impairment, as well as children with intellectual disability, are even more vulnerable, because we know that a silent victim is the perfect victim. Fortunately, there are some tools that are available and that we can use to help us address this very important neglect and abuse. And the one is the Sustainable Development Goals, or the 2030 Agenda. And one of the goals there, specifically Goal 16, talks about peace and justice. So that is really a great step in the right direction to say that this has been prioritized and that there are certain indicators that have been set according to which we can measure what is happening in this area. And then also everybody is aware of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then we also have the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, where Article 7 specifically focuses on the child. So if we look at all of these different rights that are awarded to children, we can basically divide them into positive rights. So those are the rights that you need to be provided with, and the rights that will help you to participate. So the provision rights are all of the rights related to provision of medical care, provision of access to education, provision of a home. where the participation rights are the ones where you are already in the situation and you can do something. So that would be, for example, for children, the opportunity to play, the opportunity to be in education that is appropriate for your condition. And then we have what is termed negative rights, and they are actually all of the protection rights. They are all of those rights that help prevent things happening. So that would be the right to safety and the right to be free from neglect or abuse. So if we look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there's these 5 very specific articles that focuses specifically on abuse. I'm not going to go into them in detail. I would like us to get here and to talk about participation. Because we know, as we've heard this whole morning, it is about these 2 dimensions. It is about being there, but also about what you do when you are there. And if we look at what happens in the criminal justice system, we see that exactly these 2 same constructs apply. So how do we navigate around these 2 things, and what are some of the things that we need to think about? So first of all, if we focus on the being there component, the attendance, we know that a lot of studies that have been done in poverty settings only focus on Maslow's bottom hierarchy level. So it really just focuses on all of those physiological needs, clean water, food to eat, and it does not start to focus on any of the higher order needs, like, for example, safety. We also find that a lot of the studies don't listen to children's own voices because in research it's complex to get these voices from the children themselves. So it's so much easier to rather ask those people that have the communication skills to be able to tell us. So we ask the parents, we ask the teachers, and if we think about childhood abuse, we know that very often these exact same people that are used as the proxies might be a part of the abusers. So it really is important that we listen to the children's voices themselves. We also saw in a study that we did that when we compare what parents think and what children think, when we ask them about their basic needs, so on the lowest level of Maslow, that they tend to answer in the same way. But the moment when you start asking the more complicated things, that's when you find a big discrepancy between what the proxies and what the children themselves rate. Also, if we think about the being there component, caregivers are aware of the importance of being there. In a big study that we did with 220 parents of children with intellectual disabilities in South Africa, this right, the right to protection, was mentioned 172 times. So that tells us that this is something that's right up front there in parents' minds. It was also interesting that there was a big discrepancy between what the parents in urban areas answered as compared to parents in rural areas, with the parents in the urban areas being much more aware of what the rights were and also mentioning the right to protection and the right to not be discriminated against being mentioned very frequently by the parents in the urban areas, but not so much in the rural areas. In order for us to make sure that a child is there, we need one concerned adult who will start to initiate this process. We find that children cannot start this process on their own, so there has to be one trusted adult that they can disclose to and who will walk this road with the child. And then we need to think about access at multiple different layers. First of all, the access to police stations. Police stations are not very child-friendly environments where children feel free to be able to tell what had happened to them. If we just think about how the counters look in South African police stations, you can't even see the child across the counter. And although there are very often these special rooms where children should be able to tell their story, we find that that is very often used as the tea room or the room where they would serve lunch. So that it's not really an accessible place. If we think about the social workers, forensic nurses need to be trained specifically how to make sure that they can interview the children, because if we can't get the children there, we can't initiate the process and go any further. And then as well as talking about all of the people in the court system themselves, thinking about the attorneys, the prosecutors, the judges, the presiding officers. So all of those different layers and how to actually involve them in knowing how to interact with a child. Knowing how to interact with children is not part of the core curriculum of any of those people in the legal justice system. And so it really is quite challenging if we try to tell them what child-friendly language is, for example. It's a totally foreign concept. So then if we think about involvement, so now we have the children there, now we need to do something with the children. These are some of the things that we need to think of. First of all, is just about the vocabulary that children need to disclose abuse. And that has very specific implications for preschoolers. It has implications of, for example, knowing what the different body parts are. We know that body parts is something that people don't discuss all of the body parts and give them proper names, and we call these things all kinds of interesting names, which makes it quite difficult if you want to go to court and explain what had happened. It's important to be able to teach children about what is private and what is public. What is private body parts and what are public body parts? What are private places and what are public places? What secrets are appropriate secrets and good secrets? And which secrets are those secrets that you really shouldn't keep? So how to think around all of this vocabulary that we need. Then, secondly, after there has been a disclosure, we need to think of the next step, and that is the specific vocabulary that children need when they go to court. And the questions that they will need to answer are these questions related to the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how it was done. So very often for children, it's very difficult to have a timeline of events. So it's much easier to say, did it happen before your birthday or after your birthday? Did it happen before Christmas or after Christmas? So that you rather try and have it a specific event that they can relate to rather than asking them about specific dates. Then I think it's of crucial importance that we really investigate what all of these different barriers are in the justice system. So for example, to train about the types of questions that are allowed so that you do not ask these double-ended questions because children simply don't understand those questions. That they should be able to testify without having to face this perpetrator because we know there's all of these power relations, that they should be allowed to maybe testify in the judge's chambers and not in the open courtroom, which is really very scary. And then also the use of an intermediary, so somebody that's there with a child and that can interpret to the child what the questions are, but also interpret back what the child is saying. The use of talking mats is one of the examples of things that we can do to just get children to express their opinions, because then it's a very logical, straightforward way of questioning them. And then finally, I think it's really important that we think about all of these violence prevention programs. And there's not a lot of violence prevention programs for children, preschool children with disabilities. There are some programs available for children without disabilities, but we really need to see how we can adapt it so that all of these children can understand exactly what these constructs are. These are the important things that we need to think of, is how to recognize and name feelings, how to build self-esteem, knowing about boundaries, as I said, basic safety skills. And then it really is very important, a process that we have started trying to train police officers in terms of being more sensitive towards children. I think that has been one of the hardest jobs that I've ever had, is trying to get them to understand some of these concepts. But I think just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And then in closing, I really want to say that Einstein said, "The world is a dangerous place. not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look and do nothing. Nobody should ever say that we looked and that we did nothing. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And now we're going into the last presenter before lunch, Christine Imms from Australian Catholic University. And Christine and I have been discussing engagement and being there and participation for several years. And, well, you present the model. Okay?
Am I good now? Thank you. You have been sitting for such a long time. Are you okay? Very good. Thank you. All right. So thank you. It has been a really rich morning already, yes? Very rich. Well, now for something completely different, so I think. So Mats has asked me to talk about the framework that we have been working with for some time. And so I said, all right, I'll do that. So what I'm going to do in the next, I think I have 27 minutes, is that right? So, how many? Oh, 30. That's good. I'm going to talk about the origins of this framework that we've been working on. Then I'm going to walk you through step by step the components that are in the framework. And then I'd like to just finish up by focusing on transactions as a piece of that. And I think it is really a privilege to be in this morning session and to have heard about the work across from Rune around inclusion and then through the preschool environments in different settings and the questions that are raised for us and then to go into a criminal justice system. And so I think one of the things that I suppose I've been grappling with is how to think about these constructs of participation that can be thought about in universal ways that are not dependent on the situation or the activity. So I guess that's something to think about when I'm talking. So the origins of this particular framework are absolutely within the ICF, and I think that we would see that participation in childhood disability research really took a very big upward trend in terms of volume once the ICF was published in 2001. But I do think that it's really critical to remind ourselves that that's not when we started to talk about and do things that would enable children to be involved and engaged in their different life situations. That's actually when the word participation became, it sort of got put on the map, if you like, in terms of our research. So prior to that, if we remember back to the ICIDH, we had this word handicap, and prior to that we had other words that we talked about, certainly in my field of occupational therapy. But in 2001, the ICF published this international classification of functioning, disability and health, and it defined participation as the nature and extent of involvement in a life situation, and that was neutral, that was the sort of positive situation, I suppose you would say, and then the negative situation would be a restriction in that. So when the ICF published this framework, it also published a classification system. And I have to take my jacket off. Sorry, I knew that before I even started. I should take my jacket off. I always get hot talking. So there's a classification system as well as a framework. And in the classification system, the two words, activities and participation, were actually put together. And so whilst the framework separated activity from participation very clearly in its diagram, in the way that the diagram was structured and the framework was described, within the classification system, where we got into the chapters, the two were brought together. And that meant that we had then some domains around life areas and some constructs around capacity and performance, and that the activity limitation, participation restriction were all situated within this one set of chapters within the frameworks. And that meant that those constructs were given as a single list, and that it was the performance qualifier that was used to describe what the individual did in their current environment, what that was decided to be the participation construct, and the capacity qualifier that was the activity construct. And the reason for that was that because the current environment included a social context and that therefore performance could be seen as involvement in a life situation. So that was sort of the situation within the ICF. Now, in the ICF manual, or the ICFCY manual, it certainly says that it's difficult to distinguish between activities and participation on the basis of the domains and within those chapters. And so we were given some choices back from 2001 about whether we would pick particular domains as activities and others as participation without any overlap, whether we would do the same but we could have partial overlap between them, or whether we would designate all the details, domains as activities and the broad categories as participation, or we could use all the domains as activities and participation. So we were given quite a lot of choice, really. And so what that meant was people went, okay, well, I'm going to do this, and somebody else would think, well, I'm going to do this. And so that's really how our research progressed from that point. So a really rich opportunity to focus on participation and activity, but then a wide range of choice about how you might do that. So if I think about my own research over that period of time, I started a longitudinal study of participation of children with cerebral palsy. It actually got started in 2006 in terms of data collection. And over the time since then, we've been following these children who were in late primary school at that time, and they're now young adults. And then along the way, we embedded qualitative research to really understand what was important to them in terms of participation. And then as we got to know about their situation in terms of what they were participating in, and we started to think we might have had some ideas about how to improve participation as an outcome. We started some pilot studies in that area. And then I really kind of stopped and thought, no, I have to step back. And the work that we were doing together, we really felt we needed to step back and see if we could unpack a little bit more this distinction between activity and participation from within the ICF. Because really since 2001 when it was first published, research has done a lot of work, not just my research, lots of people around the world have done a lot of work around mapping participation patterns, trying to understand participation barriers and facilitators, what makes it easy, what makes it hard, who's a high or low participator under what circumstance. But all through that period of time, there's been a big discourse in the literature around the difference between activity and participation. And so people have handled it in quite different ways. So what we decided to do collaboratively as a group was we decided to, about 2014-15, decided to actually take a chance to stop and look at the research in childhood disability to see if we could answer this question. Are we making a difference in participation outcomes for children with a childhood onset disability? It's now 14, 15 years since the publication of the ICF. What's out there? And so we undertook a systematic review of the effect of interventions that specifically aimed to improve participation outcomes in children. And through that review, we were very clear that we were not only looking at health-based services, we were interested in education and psychology-based interventions as well. But it was a systematic review of intervention effects. So from that review, in which we did the search in 2014, there were only 7 randomised controlled trials that we could find out of a large search of the literature that actually had participation as a direct outcome that was named within them that we found. Of those 7 RCTs, the types of interventions that were being offered focused on building skills or promoting the functional performance of children. There were some interventions that looked at coaching, some that were provided in group settings and some in individual settings, and there were some that were goal-focused in their approach. There was quite a broad range of approaches to providing interventions to change participation. And in terms of outcomes, only 3 of those 7 showed a positive effect on participation changes at the end of the intervention. And those changes were an increase in engagement, however that was defined in that study, increase in school attendance, and then increased recreational diversity, so the number of activities children would do. So when we had finished that, we also felt when we had read those papers, and Mats will recall that some of them felt like quite unusual interventions that were being offered to try and change participation outcomes. The ways people were talking about participation were quite diverse. And so one of our goals from this review had been to see if we could have a better understanding from the literature what people were defining participation as. And at the end of doing this part of the formal systematic review, we really felt we didn't have any better understanding of what this participation construct was or how it would differ from activity. So then we thought we really have to ask this question. So what do intervention researchers really mean by participation when they study it? And so for this, what we did was we went back into the search that we had completed looking for intervention research, and we said, well, okay, we won't just look at the RCTs because we don't want to just look at the intervention effect. We will actually look at all of the intervention studies, no matter their design. And so we then did a qualitative review, really, where we extracted the text from 25 intervention studies whenever the authors talked about participation. So we took out the text from those studies, and for some of those studies that was a lot of text, and for some of those studies it was like, I don't know, 3 or 4 lines. It wasn't very much. But these were all studies that actually said that they were going to change participation as one of the outcomes. Of those 25 studies, only 4 provided a definition of participation, even though they aimed to change participation. A further 6 referred to the ICF but didn't use the definition. And across those 25 studies, there were 38 different measures that were used to measure participation. So quite diverse. I think not dissimilar to what you were saying, Renee. And then if we looked at those and we looked at the text, we were able to do a thematic analysis on the text that we had extracted from those 25 studies. And the thematic analysis came up with 6 themes. And what we also did was we extracted the information about the measures that these intervention researchers had used within their studies to measure participation. Now in that, what we took was the language from the original author of those 38 measures, not what the author of the intervention study said they were using it for, but really what the measure was designed for. And so we sort of extracted what was the construct of the measure to see if we could map what the authors were talking about when they talked about participation to what was being measured in the measure that they chose to measure participation. So try and draw in those links. So the 6 themes were these: attendance, so participation attendance, involvement while you were there, activity competence, so could you do it properly, a sense of self, things like confidence, self-determination, preferences, and environment. And of those 6 themes, we determined that these 2 were the participation construct and that the other 4 were related to participation and important for participation, but not participation. And so from that, at the end of this systematic review, we came up with this idea that there was a family of participation-related constructs, and we would situate those constructs within an environment. And in this particular little framework, we talked about the perceived environment, if you like, or at least elements of the perceived environment. And that there were 2 elements that were participation, the attendance and involvement, and then those 3 person-related elements that were not participation. When we finished this review and we did the mapping back to the measures that people were choosing to measure their participation outcomes, we could map them. Most people did choose measures in ways that were aligned with these themes within their papers, so that made good sense. But actually the most common outcome that was measured and called participation was an activity competence measure at the end of that. So the next thing that we did was we said, well, okay, at the end of this we would define then participation as involvement in a life situation consistent with the ICF that has 2 essential elements, attendance and involvement. And the attendance, you have already heard this definition this morning, is that of being there, measured as frequency of attendance and or the range or diversity of activities in which an individual takes part. And then the involvement, now this definition is from that content analysis. So this is the language used by those researchers. And so it's defined as the experience of participation while attending and might include elements of engagement, persistence, perhaps social connection and affect. So those are the 2 elements. So what we did then was we looked at the paper that we had published that had been, those elements, those themes had been derived empirically from the research that had been done. So what we said then was, okay, now we need to see whether or not those components make sense. So is there some sort of theoretical background or backup to that idea? So then we undertook this conceptual piece of work, which is the paper I think that I won't ask you to put your hand up if you've read it, but was sent out with our information for these 2 days. So the purpose of this was really to look at what could we underpin our ideas from this systematic review, and could we provide some enhanced conceptual clarity for research and practice when we think about participation as both a means and an ends to good outcomes. So this is the process of going from this funny little shape that came out of the systematic review into this funny little shape that's now in the other paper. So we're going to just look at each of the shapes. So we would see in this family of participation-related constructs that all participation occurs in an environment, and we define the environment as the broad, objective, physical and social structures in which we live. We're in Sweden, we're in a university setting, we're in this together. But actually, the environment is not only objective, but there is a perceived and element of that environment. And sometimes your perceptions of whether the environment is available and accessible and affordable will also influence whether or not you can be in that environment. And then the extent to which it's accommodating and acceptable will also influence your participation. And in fact, when we think about these elements, whether they're objective or indeed perceived, so I would say that the available, accessible and affordable elements of the environment are most likely to be related to attendance, and the how accommodating the environment is to you and how acceptable the accommodations that are made are to you and everybody else in the context relates more to the involvement element probably. But within that environment we have, as Mats has already indicated earlier today, this idea of a context or a niche. And the context is the setting for the activity participation. And so that's the people, the place, the objects, the activity and the time that situates around the participation. And I think that Beata Botorowicz and Gillian King have done some really nice work around trying to disentangle these two constructs of environment and context. Construct and context, that's a bit hard, isn't it? Sorry. Okay, so we have an environment, we have a context, and now we have the participation which is in there. We've already said it has two elements. The first is attendance, and that's being there. In the first little model that we came out of the systematic review, attendance was seen as part of a sequence, that if you could attend, then you could be involved. If you were involved, then you would develop some competence. If you had competence, you'd have a sense of self. If you had a good sense of self, you might have preferences, you might attend again. Seen a little linear, even if circular. In this framework we put attendance in and then we put involvement in the middle of attendance, because attendance is seen as a necessary component to involvement. If you can't be there, you can't be involved. And the involvement is that experience while attending. Then if we think about the other elements, activity competence, sense of self and preferences, we define activity competence as the ability to execute the activity to an expected standard, often defined as independence or doing something that's developmentally appropriate, doing as I've told you to do, things like that. Sense of self, this are perceptions of confidence, satisfaction and self-determination. Preferences, interests and activities that hold meaning or are valued. And then I think what we need to think about is how do these intrapersonal elements come together? And some of the work that we did in the conceptual paper was really looking at the importance of self-regulation as kind of the glue, if you like, that binds together those intrapersonal components. So this sort of self-regulation being the executive processes that direct and monitor your thinking, your emotions and your actions. And so that those components within the individual that are quite important. And I think we've heard some of that already this morning as well. Okay, so then we have the bits in the framework, but now we need to think about what are the processes or the transactions. And one of the incredibly valuable things about the ICF framework is the fact that it has bidirectional arrows between the different components of the framework, that it really does situate our thinking within a transactional framework. I think what we do though is we tend to focus on the boxes, not the arrows. So now we want to focus a little bit on the arrows. So when we were thinking about the transactional processes that occur between an individual and a participatory experience, we would think about activity competence and participation as being an opportunity for an individual to be acting within a situation and learning from that action. And if we think about sense of self, then we have the opportunity for an individual to be engaging in a participatory situation and perceiving that engagement and their experience of that engagement as they move through that time. And then preferences as being an opportunity to be choosing what you can do, or if you can't be choosing, and often we can't, complying or coping with the choices of others as an action. There are also interactions between those intrapersonal elements that we would think about experiencing and interpreting. So we might think that an individual has an opportunity to participating in a particular activity, and that they experience themselves as competent or not in that situation, and that it is the interpretation of that experience that influences their sense of self and the development of future preferences for continuing in that experience. So that's about the individual in the moment, but we mustn't forget that actually the individual is within a context, in an environment, and I think we often do, as Matt's indicated earlier this morning, focus quite a lot on what happens to the child in response to an environment, and we don't often look at what does the child bring to an environment and a context. So the environment and context might be seen as providing and regulating and other verbs that you might want to think about, and the child or the individual within that situation is responding and influencing and changing that context and environment as well. So we see then that participation can be viewed as an outcome, and if we think about participation as an outcome, then attendance and or involvement can be influenced by the environment, the context, and those intrapersonal elements of activity, competence, sense of self, and preferences. And I have put body structures and functions back in here. It's not the focus of our framework, but it's not to be forgotten altogether. It can also be seen as a process, in which case we would say that if it's a process, then participation, attendance and or involvement influences those other elements of competence, sense of self, preferences, body functions, context and environment. So participation, a means and an ends. So what this framework says about change is that it is bidirectional, that they are transactional processes that occur between and among the domains. And again, I would say that for this framework, we have separated participation from the life situation conceptually, so that it could be applied in different cultures, contexts, situations, courtrooms, classrooms, would be the relevance of it. Now, I'm going to just slightly change track a little bit away from the framework in my last couple of minutes to talk about transactional processes, because I think that one of the things that I felt that we had been able to achieve with the framework was clarity around the constructs of participation, attendance and involvement, and the separation of activity, and that I think is important. But I think what we still have to do is really think about, well, what are these transactional processes? And I was pleased to hear Samaroff come up this morning, because I think that there's a lot to be learned from what has gone before. So some work that I've been doing with Canadian colleagues has been looking at transactional processes and how they might influence the delivery of paediatric services. But not going to go into that in any detail. But really, in terms of these four tenets of life course change, if you like. If we think about transactional processes, then we would see that they involve exchanges of person and context over time that lead to those adaptive outcomes. And I think these are just words that I've seen on the slides already this morning from the other presentations. We would also see that that means, though, that it's the child's changing opportunity structures, so the structure of their opportunities and their experiences that affects their adaptive development. So we need to think about how do we structure their opportunities and their experiences. And that there are numerous pathways to positive developmental outcomes, we know that. And that there are periods of differential sensitivity of person-environment relations. So there might be really important parts of a child's life where getting the fit between context, environment and individual is critical. And there might be other times where it's less critical, there's more resilience, if you like. Now, at the risk of being right off topic, I'm actually going to just talk a little bit about a project that we have been doing with young adults. Now, I realise that young adults are not children in preschool, but this particular project is actually about taking a life course approach to promoting participation and life quality for individuals with cerebral palsy from childhood to adulthood. And the very specific purpose is to talk to young adults and ask them to look back and to talk to us and tell us what they think was important to their development and their opportunities in terms of participation, in a way to help us build guidelines. So it's their reflections back. Now, the specific project had a focus on health development, and it was informed by Neil Halfon's Life Course Health Development Model, and we used a qualitative method. So we've done interviews with 22 young adults or parents when the adults were not able to answer on their own. Now, in the first instance, we wanted to know what they thought health was, and that was tricky, and so it ended up, we asked them about what is healthy living, and then we asked them to talk about how it developed over their life course. So that was the focus. And so healthy living is conceptualised then as how a person participates in meaningful activities and has important experiences in everyday contexts. It wasn't about eating the right food and exercising enough. And then the 4 themes that came out of this particular study is that, first of all, there was a personal life course, and that was seen as a dynamic and constantly changing person over time, and that these young adults talked about themselves as being on a journey of establishing developmental capacities over time, and that it was a never-ending journey of development. They also talked about a contextual life course. And so this was really around that transactional notion again, that there was an ongoing mutually independent relationship amongst the person themselves and the many contexts of their lives, that it was really difficult to separate one context from another, and that those transactions and experiences across the contexts became really important over time. And then experiences turns out to be the bit where the transactional relationships really occur. And that it's that transaction within the everyday experiences of their lives that things occur and change and develop and adaptations take place, for better or for worse. And then those adaptive processes are those that result in development of a healthy living as a process over all time across their lifespans. And that occurs as a result of their reflecting on and learning from their different experiences. That was a process of thinking about things. So in some ways we're not finished this project yet, so we're still in the midst of actually really doing some final interpretations. But some of the messages are that it's a multidimensional process characterised by ongoing transactions that are unique to the individual in their own contexts, and that it's through opportunities in real life, I call it real life, I'm not sure when you're not doing real life, if anybody knows that, let me know, experiences that individuals develop capacities for healthy living, their desired social roles, and that they learn to adapt to their changing circumstances. So the individual's adaptive processes were occurring through what was described as an entwined process, responses to impacts on learning from contextual and life course experiences over time, and that those adaptive processes change the nature of the context that the individual finds themselves in and their capacities and abilities throughout their life. So I thought that was just a nice way to think, because I think every time we're thinking about early childhood, it's not only about the here and now, it's also about the future. So I thought having an opportunity to reflect, to hear from those who've been reflecting back. So I think the messages are that those participants were not describing the development of cognitive, affective, physical or relational skills and abilities, which is often how we think about what we do when we study the impact of our interventions. The development was seen as something that occurred while you were busy experiencing life, both positively and negatively. And that looking back and reflecting on opportunities, both lost and used, highlighted the complexity, including both routine daily stuff and important turning points, things that really mattered, but often only on reflection. So if I come back to the family of participation-related constructs, I would say to you that the blobs are not as important as the arrows. Understanding the transaction between the domains and among the domains and supporting processes is really important. I think that's where really important knowledge resides about how and what changes over time, as well as the entry point for our interventions. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you everyone for listening, even though maybe your engagement level went down a little bit at the end, not because of Christine, but because of sitting for so long. So what we can learn from this is that children shouldn't sit too long in school, because it's not good for their engagement. Before you, Madeleine texted me and said, please tell people that those of you who haven't signed up for a theme or strand this afternoon, do that now, because we need to know how many there are. And Madeleine had them there. Okay? So let's come back here after lunch. So we start here and talk a little bit about how we do with the different strands. Okay? Thank you.